Hello and welcome to the President's Podcast right here on the record with the Ohio Senate. The views the news excludes. I'm John Fortney, the Director of Communication with the Senate Republican Caucus, the Majority Caucus in the Ohio Senate. Great to have on the program today the Senate's newest member, State Senator Susan Manchester, who is a Republican from Waynesfield, Ohio, in the 12th District, right? Did I get that right?
The 12th Senate District, you got it.
You are no stranger to the Ohio General Assembly, however.
No.
How many terms did you serve in the House?
I served 3 terms in the House, so a total of 6 years there.
Let me know a little bit about your background then. I mean, where did you get your interest in public policy and wanting to be an elected official in the Ohio General Assembly?
Well, I grew up on my family's farm just outside of Waynesfield, Ohio. Very big, bustling metropolis, you know.
Those are the best kind. I'm from farm country. You know what they say, you can take the boy out of the country, but not the country out of the boy.
That's exactly right.
So grew up on the family farm. What did you farm?
We did corn and soybeans, popcorn at the time. And we don't do that anymore, unfortunately, but we do corn, soybeans, and wheat now.
So this is a busy time of year right now.
Getting there. We're ramping up, getting ready for planting season. So, yeah, it's a good time.
What is the state of agriculture in Ohio? Do you think, is it still the number one industry? And what can we do to continue to make it, cutting edge? Because if you don't have food, if you're not taking care of the farmers, there's nothing to eat.
That's exactly right, John. And I believe Ohio does have agriculture as its number one industry. I represent the number one ag district in the state, which I'm very proud of, obviously being from the family farm. And a lot of my initiatives in the House and currently in the Senate have focused on being able to protect our agricultural industry. In the House, one of the bills that I had signed into law that I was very proud of created the Beginning Farmer Tax Credit Program, which addressed some of the issues that we're seeing currently with the number of farmers who are reaching retirement age and working on that succession planning of who's going to take over next. So my tax credit program basically allowed for a tax credit for any outgoing farmer who sells or rents land or assets to a beginning farmer. And that program's been up and running for a few years. I would love to see more participation, so I always, whenever I can, talk about the merits of it because I think it is a great deal for outgoing farmers across the state.
Well, let's face it, farmers feed the world, they feed Ohio, and I think a lot of people who maybe growing up never were you didn't necessarily have to live on a farm, but if you had large gardens, you understood the work and sometimes the risk that goes into it. Let's face it, I mean, when you're working with heavy equipment, big dually tractors pulling thousands of pounds of grain cart, running what they call dump on the go during the harvest season, you have the combine here and then the grain carts here. That's a skill set.
Indeed.
And there is a lot of expense and risk that goes into farming that maybe people aren't aware of.
There's definitely a lot of risk, a lot of expense, and like everything, farming inputs have only become more expensive over the years. So it is tough to run a successful farm operation, and that's what the Beginning Farmer Tax Credit Program tried to address as well by allowing for beginning farmers to take a qualified financial management course so they can learn the finances of running a farm. But something I'm working on now in the Senate is actually dealing with what are called Farm Bureau health plans. And I'm very excited about this option. It is an individualized health plan that's available to any member of Farm Bureau. And what we found and what I know, even being on the farm and being in a community of farmers, is it's very difficult to figure out your insurance options. Most farmers are self-employed. They own their own operation. They might have very few employees. Many people might have a spouse who works that gives health insurance. But for a lot of folks, the options are very minimal. And so what my bill would do is it would create this Farm Bureau health plan that would simply provide another health care option for our farmers.
What a wonderful opportunity. Senate Bill 100, I believe. Correct. And where does that stand now? That's in committee?
Yeah, and it's gone through the process very well. We've had 3 hearings already, and I anticipate that it'll be coming up for a vote very soon.
So it would be health insurance then for farmers who are Farm Bureau members. Mm-hmm. And I would assume that I've known a few farmers throughout the years. They work 12, 14-hour days, literally before the sun comes up till after the sun goes down, especially when it comes to getting the seeds in the ground and then the crops harvested. I would assume that farmers probably don't always put themselves number one when it comes to their health care, do they?
Well, there's a lot of jokes out there about farmers not going to the doctor very often. I can personally attest to that with what I've seen. But at the end of the day, healthcare is often what drives our economic decisions. And as I mentioned before, a lot of farmers are in a situation where maybe they're taking on a second job so that they can get health insurance. Or, as I mentioned too, a spouse is working so that the family gains health insurance. And sometimes that spouse might prefer to stay at home and work on the farm as well. Or, as you mentioned, the hours are long and difficult. And so trying to maintain a second job on top of that is not always easy. And they do it because they want to farm. And I think that's really the crux of this bill, is to allow more people that option to continue doing what they do best, which is farm.
Yeah, generating the food that we eat, and as we go to our next topic, generating the power that we need. Senate Bill 2 recently passed the Senate. Last week's podcast, we had Senator Reineke on, President McCauley, and Senator Wilkin, who talked about the real winning scenario of this bill to push Ohio into the 21st century for baseload power generation. That's something that you supported.
Absolutely. And it was exciting. I got to be on the Energy Committee, so heard the bill through the whole committee process. And honestly, energy issues were not something that I had worked on much in the House, so this was a really, really good learning experience for me. And I was so grateful to have the expertise that we have in the Senate driving this legislation. With Senator Reineke, who was a former energy chair, Senator Chavez, who came from the energy industry, and even President McCauley. All three of them really have great backgrounds when it comes to developing policies that are going to move Ohio forward, and that's what we're all here for. So it was great to be a part of that.
Affordability, accountability, and reliability, and really it's accountable to the consumers because the ESPs, or the electric security plans, otherwise known as riders, that show up as additional charges on your bill, if this is passed by the House and then signed into law, those would go away. So there is accountability to the average Ohio power consumer that has to, pay their power bill every month.
Absolutely. And everyone notices when their power bill goes up.
Yeah.
We definitely want to do whatever we can on the policy side of things to ensure that we're keeping those bills low and at the same time building up our ability to generate so that we can attract more business here, which is ultimately going to create more jobs and feed into the whole system. And that's what we love to see.
Yeah, and attracting new investment in Ohio. It seems that over the last decade, much has been done to make Ohio much more attractive for major investment, because 10 years ago, when I started in the Senate, there were 9 state income tax brackets. Now there's 2. Ongoing debate within the operating budget discussion right now for the next 2-year budget that needs to be passed and signed into law, mandated that way by the Constitution of Ohio, of trying to get down to maybe 1 tax bracket. What's your overall opinion of the tax reform, at least on the income tax side, that has happened in Ohio?
I want Ohio to be a zero income tax state, and here's why. If you look at the states where people are flocking to, Tennessee, Texas, and Florida, one thing all 3 of those states have in common, aside from the great weather, is they are zero income tax states. And I think Ohio, unfortunately, we can't do a whole lot about the weather, John, but I do think as far as our tax structure goes, we can make great headway by adding Ohio to the list of zero income tax states, which is ultimately going to bring more people here, in my opinion.
Yeah, and if you like the change of seasons, right?
Ohio's a great place.
It's a great place, absolutely. So as we also talk about the operating budget, school funding is always a big issue. We had the fair funding formula, and there continues to be more debate about exactly what the school funding formula or funding in general for schools should look like. I've always made the point, however, repeatedly on this program, that when we hear from the left, when we hear from the opponents where no amount of money is ever enough, they continually talk about Ohio's unconstitutional school funding system, to which that is flat wrong. I mean, that's an outright lie, because it has been constitutional since the Ohio Supreme Court released the case in 2003. So every budget thereafter that included a school funding formula has been constitutional. And in the current budget that we're operating under right now, there was an additional $1 billion invested into K through 12 education. What's your overall thought about taxes, school funding in Ohio, and the state of our schools?
We're at a critical moment in Ohio because, as you well know, schools are funded both through the state and also at the local level through property taxes. And unfortunately, with the way the housing market has been and how property values have increased, that's also greatly affected people's property taxes, which is a huge issue in my district and I know in many others right now. So that's something that the legislature needs to continue to look forward to addressing. On the school funding formula, I think that we again, need to do whatever we can to create the most reliable and predictable scenario for our schools. I am proud to represent some of the best public schools in the state, and I personally grew up in a very small town. I went to a very small rural school, and we certainly had our troubles at times. I remember in high school chemistry, we didn't do a single experiment. And, frankly, I'm not really sure what you could attribute that to, but there is a reality that we want to ensure our kids are getting the best education possible, but do it in a fiscally responsible way. And I think that's always the balance that we need to address in the legislative level.
Yeah, and to have parents involved in going to the school board meetings and to be asking the questions about what exactly is that levy paying for. Isn't that important?
Absolutely. That's everything. And I would say that's why I represent some of the best public schools in the state, because the parents are involved, the community supports the school. Everyone is wrapped around that building because it's the main act in town. In my hometown, the best Friday nights were those spent at the high school basketball games or football games. And that's really a lot of the communities that I represent. And I think for me personally, I just see the value of that community investment, and whatever we can do to encourage that is important.
Well, when DeRolf was originally filed back in the late 90s or right around 2000, it was really a building issue. It challenged the dilapidated buildings in Perry County. And since then, more than $14 billion and counting has been spent and invested in new school construction around the state of Ohio. It's amazing to see some of these schools. My old school system, they just consolidated the campus into one. The high school is just across the parking lot, and then you have the, K through 8 in basically where I went to school. So, and it's really been a great thing because communities, at least there, they found value in consolidating a lot of those satellite schools that, provided an hour and a half or 2 hour bus ride for some of the students to get there. So school buildings and having a modern technology building has really made a difference. Would you agree? Absolutely,
it has. I mean, I know my school that I went to is no longer there. We got a new school in 2008 is when they started construction on that. That's when the state was offering quite a bit of funding to certain school districts to build new school buildings, and I think that was a good thing.
You're a chair of a committee in the Senate. What committee is that?
Government Oversight and Reform.
Give us the basic, duties of government oversight and reform, what that covers.
Yeah, it covers a wide variety of issues. I mean, it's kind of hard to boil it down to one thing. I would say we're a pretty catch-all committee, honestly. So we have a lot of bills naming certain days to commemorate prominent Ohioans. We also had a bill dealing with the the building codes for building new houses. we cover a wide variety of issues. So I've enjoyed that as the chair because it really keeps me on my toes as far as what we're going to see come before us.
Were you pleased that the unanimous vote for the transportation budget was not only unanimous, but also came free of any increase on gas or diesel taxes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think building good roads and bridges is the basic function of government. So I think it's important for us to invest in our infrastructure, especially as we grow as a state. And I think it's excellent when we can all come to a consensus on that.
People tend to live in their own little world in the state of Ohio. Ohio is a pretty big state, not as big as Texas, of course, but it takes 3.5 hours to get from one corner of Ohio to the other corner, and people live their lives in, basically that little 50 square mile area or so. Give us your best sale on why we should come visit Waynesfield, Northwest Ohio.
Oh boy.
What if you love the countryside, that would be a great one tank trip.
Yes, well, come in the summertime because that's when all the crops will be growing. It'll be very lush and green over our way. I would also just highlight a few things. Auglaize County is the home of Neil Armstrong, and there is a lovely museum in honor of him and his legacy. We also have a bicycle museum in the village of New Bremen that talks about the Wright brothers and kind of that whole trajectory. I think that we have a lot to offer in West Central Ohio. Also, Kewpie hamburgers in Lima. I mean, I can't
Former President
not mention
Huffman,
that.
current Speaker Huffman, certainly introduced us to Kewpie.
Absolutely, as he should have,
And you have Lake Erie just up the road, right?
Grand Lake St. Mary's.
Grand Lake St. Mary's. That's right.
I mean,
That's right.
I actually have Grand Lake St. Mary's, Indian Lake, and Lake Laramie, which are all used to be lakes that fed into the canal system. So that's another cool part of our history is our relationship with the canal system. And now Grand Lake, Indian Lake, Lake Laramie are great tourist attractions and booming, honestly.
Boating is big.
Yeah,
there.
Absolutely. It's
fantastic. State Senator Susan Manchester, Republican from Waynesfield, Ohio, in the 12th District. Thanks for your time today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.